continuing and probably concluding Chapter 5, Public Affairs during the Childhood of Jesus, the president was styled Nazi. Spelled Noon, Tzadi, Yud, and was chosen on account of his eminent worth and wisdom, and was sometimes to occupy the place of Moses. Sometimes the high priest had this honor. At the condemnation, Jesus, the high priest, was presiding. As we learn from Matthew 26:62, the vice president was called Abaddon and set at the right hand of the president. The Babylonian Gemara states that there were two scribes, one to record the votes of acquittal and one those of condemnation. The lictors, or attendants of the Sanhedrin, were called Aparetai in Matthew 26:58 and in Mark 14:54. While in session, the Sanhedrin sat in form of a semicircle in the front of the president. The place of the meeting of the Sanhedrin, it is supposed, was in a building near the temple, but that it might be assembled elsewhere, we learn from Matthew 26:3. When it seems to have met at the residence of the high priest, the jurisdiction of this body was mainly over questions of religion, as the trial of a tribe for idolatry, the trial of false prophets, and of the high priest and the other priests. Mishnah Sanhedrin 1, Medoth 5. But who are the elites? There was a body of ruling families of Jews in the Middle Ages, or Enlightenment period, it was into the Enlightenment period, but that set up a system. But who are they to get together to decide who is really a prophet and who is has violated the supposed religious law? According to them, but you know what I mean. Jesus was arraigned as a false prophet, and Peter, John, Stephen, and Paul as teachers of pestilential errors. According to John 11:47. Its jurisdiction seems to have extended beyond Palestine. The power of capital punishment was taken from this body 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. That is according to the Jerusalem Gemara, quoted by Selden, Book 2, chapters 5 and 11. It was for this reason the Jews answered Pilate, "It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." John 19:31. The Sanhedrin arrested, tried, convicted, and then handed the condemned over to the secular power, represented by the Roman procurator. There appears an exception in Acts 7:56 in the case of Stephen, but that was a tumultuous proceeding or an illegal assumption of power, as the execution of James in the absence of the procurator is declared by Josephus to have been, according to Antiquities 29:1. The religious sects of the day were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. What are the spellings for each group, and what do they mean? That'd be important. They point out a lot of that stuff in this book, but we shall soon see that the ministry of Jesus was antagonistic to all these, and in studying that antagonism, we shall more clearly understand the distinctive tenets and tempers of the several religionists. It is sufficient in this place to render a mere synopsis. The Pharisees, separatists as their name implies, were the Puritans of the time, claiming superior sanctity. They taught that tradition was as binding as written law, that God must have communicated much religious truth to Moses orally, as the people generally held, and had from time immemorial held certain doctrines to be as well settled as the law, although they are not mentioned in the Pentateuch, of which prayer and the resurrection of the dead are notable instances, and that this oral law was as binding as the written law. The classical passage in the Mishnah on this subject is as follows. Moses received the oral law from Sinai and delivered it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders. Well, they thought it meant the oral law, so that's not in there, but and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets to the men of the great synagogue. And no, the prophetic message is renewed by the prophets. It's not, handed down like. But I was raised in a church like that too. That generation after generation. Well, they inherited their role and they inherited the so-called scriptures, so they weren't really even knowing them by heart, really. Certain portions of them, but they held themselves to be in the succession and to have the right to interpret and apply the law. They had become the most extreme ritualists. They were formalists. They had smothered spiritual religion to death under ceremonials. They laid on the conscience burdens too heavy for men to bear. The Sadducees were a sect owing their existence to a reaction against Pharisaic teaching. The Sadducees held that oral law was not at all binding, that nothing was binding except the written law. To them, it was a logical consequence to deny a future state of rewards and punishments, as in the written law, in all the pleadings of the great lawgiver for good living and in all his threatenings against evil-doing, Moses had never called to his aid the consolation of the doctrine of future rewards, nor the terror of future punishments. It seemed to them inconceivable that he should have believed in any such doctrine. They proceeded to deny the immortality of the soul and then the existence of the soul itself. They believed in neither angel nor spirit. Now, see, some people went to extremes like that. And there is reason to believe about an afterlife. But there were rabbis that didn't have that opinion, and therefore, there are Jews that don't really have any real idea of an afterlife that they assert. The Essenes represented rather a tendency than a sect, but they grew into a community. They separated themselves from the distraction of business. They were Pharisees in doctrine in general terms, but they held towards the Pharisees very much with the relation which the Pharisees maintained toward the mass of the common people. They were the Quakers of the day of Jesus. They opposed war and slavery and commerce. They were monks, ascetics, mystics. They exerted little influence on Christianity. And, well, didn't Christianity have a lot of that? And Jesus made no special allusion to them. His life and doctrine did not accord with their views and practices. The Herodians were a political, religious sect or party. Herod the Great was of foreign descent, but was a Jew in his religious professions. There were many Jews who saw no way to sustain the national independence in face of the Roman power except in the continuance of the reign of Herod, and as they believed that the preservation of their nationality was necessary to the glory of their destiny, they would support Herod, in whom they saw a protection against direct heathen rule. Because they, just like some nowadays, go around calling people goyim. Back then people did too. It's somebody that's of a different group. They must be a goyim. Not necessarily. They didn't necessarily turn the back on God, but because heathen and pagan are, about material culture. It's not about type of religion, if you're going to use the Greco-Roman terms. Others were quite willing to have a compromise between the old Hebrew faith and the culture of the others, such as Herod seemed to be making. The political wing of the Herodians would side with the Pharisees, and the religious wing with the Sadducees. But the Herodians seemed never to have attempted to harmonize the doctrines of the two sects. It is perhaps more nearly proper to call the Herodians a coalition than a party or a sect. Now, the Catholic Church officially called non-Christians pagan and heathen until 1967, so this book is about 80 years prior to that. Well, I'm not sure what part was written at what point, because you presume it all wasn't the year it was published, but so there's that thing. And that included monotheists, all monotheists. If you didn't believe in Trinitarianism or some other form of Christian polytheism, you were automatically as a pagan. And if you were at earlier times of a different type of Christianity, again, they would label you a pagan.